So I'm going to start out with a little bit of music, and the reason for that is I was just talking with people beforehand that if you just start with Martin Luther King, you might not get the enormity of the situation that he was facing and that other people were facing during his time, which goes back to a long history of slavery and segregation and labor exploitation. So it's about labor and civil rights. And I was very pleased to be here yesterday for May Day to see that people do appreciate the history of labor and that it's not just history, that we're still making these fights. There were some good, strong speeches there yesterday, particularly your mayor of Bergen. I thought she was pretty good. I couldn't tell what she was saying, but I got the feeling of what she was saying. And so in the U.S., May Day, they've tried to turn it into Law Day, Loyalty Day, anything but Labor Day. And actually, in the United States, in the labor movement, we celebrate May Day to commemorate the struggle for the 8-hour day that in 1886, many years ago, led to a tragedy in Chicago called the Haymarket Massacre. Workers organizing for the 8-hour day, shot down by the police, their leaders incarcerated, and 4 of them hanged later. A lot of violence happened in this event, and then they blamed it all on the labor leaders. So when we think about May Day, we think about the 8-hour day and the struggle for rights on the job, while the Republicans think about loyalty and Law Day. We think about Labor Day. I wanted to thank some of the people that brought me here, Professor Gunnar Grenstad and Jan Heirat in archaeology and history and the combined unit there. Doreen Ryland did wonderful work in helping me to get housing and getting settled in here. And Hans Egil Overdahl for setting up this program, and he's working on some other things. So I'm really thrilled to be in Bergen. It's a beautiful place, and you have a beautiful university, and it's just great to be here. So my message, I've got a little button here. It's got Martin Luther King's picture on it. And that's because we've struggled for a long time to get people to really understand what King was about. And at Stanford University, we have the Martin Luther King papers. I'm at the University of Washington, Tacoma, but I work with them at Stanford for many years. And also the Martin Luther King Center in Atlanta, where King was from, and the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis. So what we try to do is help people to really remember, but to understand what it's about. And so that's what I'm going to be talking about. This book just came out a year ago, To the Promised Land. I have a few copies of it here. But, you know, the question is, why would we need another book about Martin Luther King? There have been many books. If you want to read the King literature in this book, it leads you into all of that. But this is a very short book. It's called To the Promised Land, Martin Luther King and the Fight for Economic Justice. And this is a framework that most people don't associate with King. If you ask most people, who is Martin Luther King, they'll say he was a civil rights leader. And that is true, but the way he saw it, civil rights was just the opening of a larger freedom struggle. So we have the 14th Amendment, the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery, the 14th Amendment guaranteeing equal rights before the law, and the 15th Amendment guaranteeing the right to vote. And in King's lifetime, he was born in 1929 at the beginning of the Great Depression, people had none of these rights, even though these amendments to the Constitution were adopted from 1868 to 1870, many years before. But the courts and the police and the state legislatures had just ignored all of that. And so people had no right to vote. They had segregated housing, terrible schools, no funding, police violence every day, hardly any black people on the police forces. And it was really a state of oppression, and especially for poor people, working class people, sharecroppers, people who worked on the land. Women especially had it very hard, doing triple duty, running the household, also working. Most black women worked, unlike most women in general at that time. And so it was a very hard situation. And King said, fighting to make the 14th and 15th Amendment real, that was just the first phase. He said, if we don't have citizenship rights, we can't change anything. So we first have to get these citizenship rights. And that's the civil rights phase that people are aware of, from Montgomery Bus Boycott of 1955, the big March on Washington in 1963, where he had the I Have a Dream speech, the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 64, the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But King said, this is not the end of the story. A lot of people said, okay, now you've got what you want, so go away, leave us alone. What more do you want? And he said, what more we want is economic justice. We want the right to a good job at good pay. We want opportunity in all the trades. We want universities to open up. Very few African Americans in large universities. There were a few historically black colleges. I went to Howard University, a black college, marvelous place, but most people did not have access to the higher education, and they did not have access to good jobs. And beyond that, they also had mass incarceration. We're having this issue now again, 2 million people incarcerated, 2 million in the United States. More than China, Russia, most countries combined. So this is the land of the brave and the home of the free, and here we have 2 million people incarcerated. More than half of them are black or Latinx people, and they're practically all poor people. So King's message was, at the March on Washington in 1963, was not just, I have a dream of a society where you're judged by the content of your character, not the color of your skin. That was one part of it, but the other part was, he said, we need a country where we're not stranded on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of an affluent society. And so this was what he called phase 2. So after the Voting Rights Act of 1965, from 65 to 68, when Dr. King was killed, he was fighting for phase 2. We're still fighting about phase 1. We still don't really have full voting rights. They're trying to take those away. And we still don't have full rights before the law. Those are being shut down also. So we're fighting on both fronts, phase 1 and phase 2. The reason for the book, To the Promised Land, Martin Luther King and the Fight for Economic Justice, is my publisher, W.W. Norton, which is a pretty big publisher in New York City. With the election of Donald Trump in 2016, said, we need to get this story out to people so that this kind of veil of ignorance that the Trump administration uses to make its case for everything, so that we can sort of penetrate that and bring people back to the important message of racial, gender, and social and economic justice. And that's really why I feel people should still study King. It's not that we want to heroize somebody, or the great man. I don't believe in the great man theory of history, like this one person. If only we had King, everything would be different. No. King said at the Montgomery Bus Boycott, he said, I'm just here to serve you. I didn't start this movement. If I were dead, the movement would still continue. I'm just here to help explain it to the world. But he turned out to be the best explainer you could ever find anywhere, who could raise the issues to the large level that they deserved, which was historic, which is spiritual, which is economic, which is political. that, as he said, we, the oppressed people of this land, are now rising up and demanding our full rights. And then, what is economic justice anyway? He made a speech to the AFL-CIO, the American Federation of Labor and Congress of Industrial Organizations, in 1961. He explained it this way: economic justice would require a land where men will not take necessities to give luxuries to the few, which is the Trump agenda, where all our gifts and resources are held not for ourselves alone, but as instruments of service for the rest of humanity. And he made a similar comment. You've got this handout, I think. If you follow these quotes, you'll follow what I'm going to say next. But at the, let's see, where's our quote here from Oslo? Peoples everywhere can have 3 meals a day for their bodies, education for their minds, dignity, equality, and freedom for their spirits. And earlier in the quotes, this is 1957 at the top, I never intend to adjust myself to the evils of segregation and the tragic inequalities of an economic system which takes necessities from the masses to give luxuries to the classes. So this is early in King's life. He's only in his 20s when he's making these comments. And people, you can see right away, this is not just a civil rights framework. This is a big framework about the world. And he always had that framework. It's just that he felt that, to begin with, we have to fight for these citizenship rights or we can't change anything. So this is partly what the book is about, is to drive this home. So let me start with giving you a little bit of a feeling of American history and what he's... there we go. Let's see if it goes on. Where's our help back here? So I'm trying to get the slides to pop up.
Does that not happen?
So from the beginning, if you hit that, and
Yeah.
But first slide. Okay. But it's not coming up on the screen. You have to go down there. This always happens.
It worked right before
It worked a minute ago. Power off? Oh, did I push something wrong? No?
We're trying to restart it, I think.
Ah, okay. So while they're doing that, I'll just tell you, as a historian, I always try to use some of the songs from these time periods going way back. And the songs I'm going to use are songs that were sung by slaves to begin with. Nobody knows who wrote the song. It's not like somebody wrote it down. It's something that people made up and sang in the swamps when they couldn't hold church services on the plantation. And somehow those songs got passed from generation to generation through the churches and through other ways. Okay, that's one good one. And then a lot of these songs then made their way also into the labor movement in the United States. So let's see if we can get this going here. All right, from the beginning. And I think I've got everything on,
Sorry
okay.
about that.
So when you're watching the slides, think about the enormity of this situation. If you're somebody such as King, born in 1929, when segregation is full-blown and you're dealing with this history. Oh, oh, freedom. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom over me. And before I'd be a slave, I'd be buried in my grave and take my place with those who loved and fought before. No more hatred, no more sorrow, no more hatred over me. And before I'd be a slave, I'd be buried in my grave and take my place with those who loved and fought before. So you just have to imagine the history. You won't know what's going on in all of these slides. It shows efforts to overcome racism. It also shows racism in action. And here's a song that became part of this movement with the industrial workers of the world trying to organize unions. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. In union we can be strong. When the union's inspiration through the workers' blood shall run, there can be no power greater anywhere beneath the sun. For what force on earth is weaker than the feeble strength of one? But in union we can be strong. So yesterday we were singing the Internationale. In the U.S. you would sing this verse. See if you can sing it with me. It goes, solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. In union we are strong. Child labor was one of the big issues that people fought around, and especially the rights of women. They have taken untold millions that they never toiled to earn, but without our brain and muscle, not a single wheel would turn. We can break their haughty power, gain our freedom when we learn. In union we are strong. Okay, here's your last chance to sing it with me. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. For in union we are strong. Here's another song that came out of the movement. woke up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom. I woke up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom. I woke up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. Now in the black church, there would be call and response. So I would say, hallelujah, and you would say, hallelujah, 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 hallelujah. So you get another chance. Walking and talking with my mind. My mind, it was a state on freedom. Walking and talking with my mind. Stayed on freedom. Walking and talking with my mind. Stayed on freedom. Hallelujah. Hallelujah. Aha. Hallelujah. 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 Okay, one last time. Hallelujah. 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 So this ends you up in 1968, where Dr. King was killed in this strike of sanitation workers. And it's interesting and appropriate, really, that Dr. King died in a strike. And this is something that also most people don't understand, that King was a longtime supporter of labor rights and unions. Unions were really crucial to the Montgomery Bus Boycott in 1955, which was where King came to the nation's attention. And why? Because unions were strong at that time, and they had financial support, and they gave it to the civil rights movement. Also, a lot of unions in the United States organized around black workers who were in positions of poverty, and more than ever, more than anyone, needed a union. So let me switch here to King. So the view that we have of King as a civil rights leader is just one phase of what he had to do and what he had to say. The book, To the Promised Land, starts with his speech the night before he was killed in Memphis. He was killed on April 4th, 1968, and on April 3rd, he gave this speech where he was under tremendous pressure. He knew that there was a plot to kill him, and there was always a plot to kill King. From the time he became well-known in 1955 until his death in 1968, there were always people after him. There were several incidents where Nazi members, American Nazi Party members, we had that, attacked him in public events where he was speaking, and somebody came up to the stage and hit him in the face and then hit him in the stomach. Later on, that same person followed him around when he went, that was in Birmingham, then followed him to Chicago. And he was always under the threat of death. Why? Because he was wanting to overturn the racial system, and so the people that supported the racial system really wanted to stop him. But in addition, he also spoke out against war and poverty and for union rights. And by 1968, he had come out very strongly against the American Vietnam War. And when he did that, a whole nother segment of society turned against him. So there was a certain acceptance by 1965 after the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act of 64 that what King was saying was something the nation needed to embrace. It wasn't embraced in the South, where segregation continued on. It wasn't embraced in places like Chicago, one of the most segregated cities in the United States at the time. But it was embraced at the higher levels. Even the Republican Party accepted civil rights, that everybody should have rights before the law. They're pretty weak on that today, if not going in the opposite direction. But King, when he started to call for poor people's rights, the Poor People's Campaign in 1967, and then spoke out against the Vietnam War, the people in the power structure completely turned against him. The news media that had been giving him favorable coverage now gave him unfavorable coverage. The President of the United States, Lyndon Johnson, who had been making alliances with King, now would not talk to King anymore. One of the tragedies of the 60s in the United States was we had a president, Lyndon Johnson, from the South, who actually did the most of anybody up till that point to enact civil rights and voting rights laws, even though Lyndon Johnson was from Texas, where they didn't have those rights. It took a Southerner to get those laws through Congress, but at the same time, he bogged the U.S. down in the Vietnam War. And it was the power of anti-communism of that time that he was afraid to do anything else. That people will say, I ran away from the fight against communism if I don't pursue the Vietnam War, which was a horrible tragedy for everybody involved. 3 million Vietnamese died, 58,000 American troops, twice that many people of the troops died by suicide afterwards. It totally affected my generation of people. And it destroyed a lot of the civil rights progress that we had been making up until that time. And so in your sheet there of quotes, toward the bottom, on April 4th, 1967, 1 year before he was killed, exactly to the day, he made this very strong speech against the Vietnam War. And he said the United States is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, which may sound like a exaggeration, but who else has military bases in 80 different places in the world? Who else spends $600 billion a year on the military? Who else wants to spend $1 trillion now to renew its nuclear power, nuclear weapons, not power, nuclear weapons? The U.S. is the preeminent arms salesperson in the world. And this is what King was talking about at the time. But this put him outside of the framework of civil rights. And a lot of civil rights leaders also turned against him for that reason. So let me take you back a little more. We start here with King having a much broader framework than most people think of, that in phase 2, he organized poor people, demonstrating for union rights, seeking a moral revolution. So you have to remember, King is a minister above all. He's somebody who believes in a different spiritual framework than what was happening in the United States. He's a Baptist, which normally in the U.S. we would think of as somebody who's conservative, but he's a black Baptist following what we call the social gospel. And the social gospel is the teachings of Jesus put simply before us, that poor people and everybody deserve a right to decent life. And of course, Jesus was not in favor of war and military conquest either. So his moral revolution was to replace self-seeking individualism of the rich with an overriding concern for the common good. I'm very encouraged being in Norway because I see a lot of this in your society that I don't see in my society. It's not, I don't think, considered being a great person if you hoard the wealth and spend it on, private things, yachts. in our country, 1% of the population owns more wealth than 90% of the rest of us combined. So you have about 4 billionaires, multi-billionaires in the United States who have more money than about half the population of the world. I don't know if this could happen in any other country besides the United States, but people like Trump think this is great. This is what it's all about. But that's not what King would have said. He would have said this is sinful. And he was, to the promised land, asks us to think about the legacy of King. What was he really talking about? And he was really going against the mainstream currents in the United States economically. He wanted strong unions. He wanted strong rights on the job. He wanted an end to poverty and racial and economic injustice. He started the Poor People's Campaign in 1967 with the idea that we would create a minimum standard of living for every person. And housing, jobs, education, healthcare would be the right of every person. I see you have a lot of that here. We don't have a lot of that where I come from. So it's still a big struggle. Some of the people that endorsed this whole project talk about, I like this quote especially, compelling story of militant revolutionary love in action. That was King. Hans dug up an interview with King on December 10th, 1964 in Oslo, where he was getting the Nobel Peace Prize here. And he talked about how America could be this beacon light of freedom if it would follow the principles in the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights and the concepts of equality and liberty. But he said, we're not there, but we could be there. And if we were, we would be a beacon light to the world. Robin Kelly, my good colleague, calls this revolutionary love in action. The Norwegian interviewer says, well, doesn't this make you a revolutionary, what you're saying? Much like Jesus was a revolutionary. And King says, I suppose so, but I think what I'm saying is something that most people would like to see in the world. Another important facet of the King story that doesn't come out, it's surprising to me when I went back over the literature how little is said about slavery. It's as if King starts out as being born in 1929, and the only issue is civil rights. But actually, his great-grandparents were slaves. His grandparents were sharecroppers. His father was a sharecropper who fled the country for the city. He grew up knowing about poverty and racial injustice in his neighborhood. It was the Great Depression when he was growing up. So when we see him in a suit and tie, I have a dream, he looks like what he is, which is a PhD, probably the most learned person of his time, one of the most learned people in his time, who's a minister speaking to the nation, perfect diction and so forth. But he comes out of poverty and neighborhoods where his neighbors would be poor people, and many of the people in his church would be poor people. And his grandparents were slaves. So in these economic justice campaigns, he talks about his slave ancestors and that this was unpaid labor that needs to be paid back. So, there's the issue of reparations, as we call it in the United States. What about those 4 million people who were slaves at the time of the Civil War in 1860? What about the 20 million people that were stolen from Africa in the slave trade over 4 centuries? Is there a reason why black income relative to white is about 1/10? Family household income is about 1/10 of what it is for whites. Is there a reason that 50% of the people in prison are young black men who don't have jobs? This is all a legacy of slavery followed by segregation. So again, this is part of a framework that King had that people need to understand in order to try to correct what we're living with today. So this is not a story about just the past. This is a story about now. For him, it starts with the Montgomery Bus Boycott, and very interesting and important. A lot of great new scholarship on this. Women were at the forefront of that movement. They were the domestic workers who were riding the buses, and women were always at the forefront of civil rights and economic protest in the black community. This is Coretta King, Martin's wife. This is another thing. She was a powerhouse in his family who was in favor of speaking out for peace long before he was, because he was afraid to jeopardize his civil rights leadership. Another interesting facet, and I'll go kind of quickly now so we don't run out of time, is that King was called a communist right away. Now imagine the most famous Baptist in the world, suddenly people think he's a communist. Something distorted and weird in the United States. The FBI and J. Edgar Hoover, the director, followed him everywhere. They wiretapped his hotel rooms. They wiretapped his office. They wiretapped his home. And it started, the big campaign started where he's at Highlander Folk School. In this picture, he's with Pete Seeger, the great singer, and Rosa Parks is there in the middle, who started the Montgomery Bus Boycott. And Highlander actually is derived from the Danish folk schools of the 1920s. And the person who organized Highlander, Miles Horton, went to Denmark to learn about the folk school method of participation. The idea being that if people get together and talk about their issues, they can come up with solutions. They don't have to have somebody come in and tell them what the solution is. They can come up with that solution. And they dance and they sing. This is why singing is so important, to the civil rights movement and the freedom movement and the labor movement. So he went and gave a speech there, and in your quotes there, you find his first one: "I never intend to adjust myself to the evils of segregation and the tragic inequalities of a system that takes necessities from the masses to give luxuries to the classes." So he was already saying these things, sort of behind closed doors. And there was a man in the audience who was like an undercover agent taking pictures. And so they took a picture of King, and they claimed he was at a communist training school. So this is like 1957, 58. They put these billboards all over the country, and especially in the South. So people marching from Selma to Montgomery during the Selma voting rights protests walked right by one of these billboards. And I actually have a postcard sent to me by the John Birch Society with that picture on the front. So this was building up a hatred of King early on in his life, that he's a threat to the country. And again, the anti-communist mania of the United States at that time. The real issue is nonviolence. King is a nonviolence leader, and that in itself is revolutionary enough. James Lawson, who I made a film about, we might get a chance to show it here, who was one of King's advisors and one of the leaders of the nonviolence movement, said, "A nonviolence leader has made a major decision and analysis about violence that is all-encompassing. Violence is economic. It's not just hitting somebody on the head. Violence is poverty. Violence is racism, sexism, and so forth." Lawson said that we have to overcome all of life's cruelty systems, he calls them. So it's a big agenda for equality and equal rights, but using nonviolence rather than violence to bring about the change. And so nonviolence for King was the simple steps that Gandhi put forward. You figure out what your problem is. You confront the people in power, you make demands. You never make change if you don't make a demand. If they refuse to cooperate or make any agreements at all, then you make a plan of action. You start confronting them in the streets. You have demonstrations. You have boycotts. You have letter writing campaigns, all things that are non-violent. So you're confronting a violent system with nonviolence. And this was what King carried the South with. I was at the Martin Luther King Center in Atlanta last year, and they've built a whole series of things, but their last thing that you see when you leave is about nonviolence. That if you don't know anything about King, know this about nonviolence, what that framework means. And you can apply it anywhere at any time. King had this ability to reach people, so this is a demonstration in downtown Detroit before the March on Washington that's so famous. This march was mostly labor people, union people, United Auto Workers Union, Walter Reuther, and so forth. My timer says stop. So I'll try to go quickly. The United Farm Workers Movement, Cesar Chavez took off at this same time. This was Birmingham, the images of nonviolent protesters confronting violent police. And it was kind of like nonviolence is showing you in pictures, which side would you like to be on? Would you rather be this young man who's being very stoic, or would you rather be that policeman who's attacking him for being in a demonstration? Pick your side. You know, that was what the movement was forcing people to do, take a side to get rid of segregation. Of course, King was arrested. He was in jail 30 times during his life. He led a strike in Atlanta after he came back from the Nobel Peace Prize in Oslo. He helped to settle this strike by taking leadership in it. 800 black women at this factory who had nothing, and they needed the support of the civil rights movement. So his idea was to get labor and civil rights together, to work together. And you know, if the unions had continued and gotten stronger instead of weaker, which is what's happened, we would have had a coalition that would be a majority coalition. And it's still true today. If you poll people about labor issues, Social Security, Medicare, income issues, 80% of Americans still agree with that framework. It's just that we've lost our support system, which is we only have 11% that belong to unions today. Imagine that, only 11% belong to unions. So we're weak. We don't have the methods, the mechanisms that we had then. This was the voting rights campaign. This is John Lewis being beaten to the ground, the most, illustrious member of Congress today, a follower of King and nonviolence. And there was demonstrations all over the country. I know this because I was growing up then. I wasn't old enough to be in these demonstrations, but it affected everybody. So my high school yearbook, somebody wrote in my yearbook, you are a follower of King. This was in 1965. And I thought, oh, I didn't even know that, but I was. He affected everybody. He especially reached working class people. This is a nice picture of an audience that he has in 1967, I think, in Detroit. This is down in Mississippi, the March Against Fear, organizing voting rights down in Mississippi. He really was a man of the people. Yes, he had the suit and tie and all that, but when he got out among the people, he was the happiest. Stokely Carmichael, a more militant, supposedly, person, said, when King was with the people, he was really, really happy. And this is with Joan Baez, the singer. He was always interracial in everything he did. He supported Black Power, but only within the idea of making coalitions and building coalitions together. This was the Detroit riot of 1967. Conditions were so bad that in all the cities, these huge eruptions happened. Usually it was around police brutality against black communities. I know this one because I grew up in Michigan, and the whole state was in an uproar. 43 people were killed in this riot. The police came in, shot people out of their windows. It was horrible. This was going on all over the country in the middle of the 1960s. King was, toward the end of his life, depressed, exhausted. He spent about 300 days out of the year on the road speaking to audiences. This is after he spoke outside of Detroit, and an anti-communist group marched up to the stage and shouted him down, wouldn't let him talk because he was talking about the Vietnam War. And he found it very depressing, that you couldn't even speak. at that time without being attacked. Then he went to Memphis, got involved in the poor people's struggle of the sanitation workers. These were people who did unmechanized, mostly unmechanized, really horrible jobs. They had if they got hurt on the job, too bad. No compensation, no workers' compensation. They worked however many hours they had to. At the demonstration yesterday, one of the slogans was, "No more overtime," or forced overtime. And these people would work 12 hours a day if the employer said that's what they had to do. And they had no union rights. They were below minimum wage. They were living in poverty while working long jobs. Very dangerous work. Also, people always getting hurt. And he came to Memphis as part of his Poor People's Campaign, which was to get the government to shift priorities from military to housing, healthcare, and jobs. And so he came to Memphis to speak, and it brought a whole new level of struggle to the story. And we'll be done in a minute here.
Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom over me. And before I'd be a slave, I'd be buried in my grave. But I will rise for my right to be free.
If we are going to get equality, if we are going to get adequate wages, we are going to have to struggle for it. Now, you know what? You may have to escalate the struggle a bit. If they keep refusing and they will not recognize the union and will not agree for the check off of the collection of dues, I tell you what you ought to do, and you're together here enough to do it. In a few days, you ought to get together and just have a general work stoppage in the city of Memphis.
You know we're standing for our unions and we shall not be moved. You know we're standing for our unions and know that we shall not be moved, just like a tree that's planted by the water. We shall not be moved. And that's why I say there ain't no harm to keep your mind stayed on freedom. There ain't no harm to keep your mind stayed on freedom. There ain't no harm to keep your mind stayed on freedom. Hallelujah, 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 hallelujah. You know.
So this movement I wrote a book about it called Going Down Jericho Road. It was almost ignored that there was a big movement in Memphis, and it was a working class movement and a labor movement. People thought of King with all these previous movements, but when he was killed in Memphis, they just thought of it as that's where he was killed. But they didn't take into account that this was a major change in the civil rights movement. For him to call for a general strike as a civil rights as well as a labor rights campaign raised the civil rights struggle to another level, and to bring economic and civil rights issues together brought it to another level as well. And these are more pictures from the strike, which I won't take time to go to. But after that, after King was killed, we started, and then this is the time when I started coming into activism, trying to remember not just January 15th when Dr. King was born, but April 4th, when he was killed, what was he doing? What was that about? And so this is one of the demonstrations after Dr. King was killed. It's very much about union rights and economic justice. And I'll just do this to sign out. So the Welfare Rights Campaign and the Poor People's Campaign went on after his death. It wasn't all a failure, even though he was no longer there. We have these big movements still going on in the 70s and the 80s. Cesar Chavez, Dolores Huerta, the Farm Workers Union. And this is about the time when I enter in the Detroit anti-war campaign, student activism. I won't go into this story because it's too complicated, but I end up in jail for 3 weeks as soon as I went down south as a conscientious objector to the Vietnam War. I worked on the Free Angela Davis campaign. Some of you might know about that. These pictures are actually taken by the FBI. It was a black photographer who was a friend of ours, but he actually was working with the FBI and turning everything over. Another interesting story I could tell you about. Other cases that we worked on, many of them, this is the Wilmington 10 in North Carolina. So the 70s was a period of fighting against repression, we called it. Attempts to suppress what remained of the movements of the 60s. This is at the South African Embassy when I was a graduate student at Howard. And people still remember today the King story, not because they want to hero worship and not because they just respect the man, but because they want to continue where he left off. Even though it was 50 years ago, we're still fighting these issues in the United States. This is the Lorraine Motel where he was killed. Now it's the National Civil Rights Museum. If you ever go to Memphis, go to the National Civil Rights Museum. You'll get the whole story. And on April 4th, 2018, we had a 50-year commemoration of Dr. King. And it was amazing. People came from all over the country and all over the world to commemorate not just King, but to keep the movement going. And union people were at the forefront. And when they say, I am a man, it doesn't mean man. It means I am a person with dignity and respect. And people understand that's what that means. To be a man means to be a person. So the struggle continues. And then I went to Atlanta, and we finished with that. So what I would just conclude with is we have what I call the bonds of historical memory, the bonds, things that bind us together. Just like with religion or civic activism, you have a story, that helps to bring you together. It helps you to understand where you're going and where you came from. And if you don't have that, which many people don't, you're sort of afloat, and you don't really know which end is up. And those are the people that our President Trump likes to victimize. They don't know which way is which. They follow what he's doing, which is often against their own economic interests. Majority of poor people in the United States are still white. A lot of people who have lost their jobs. And he's passing tax cuts for the rich, not doing anything for them. So the power of remembering is crucial, I think. And that's what I'm trying to do as a historian. And finish with just the idea that the past is not over. We're part of the past. The past is never over. It's part of what we're doing today. And that we can remember this past not as a sad story, but as an important story that can help us in our own lives. So talking about the future, we would do well to follow the vision of King and many other people that speak about justice and equality for all. Thank you. So I think we have a few minutes. I welcome any comments or questions.
Any questions? Yeah.
I don't think the floor is anybody else. I don't want to speak. Okay.
Just hold it.
I hold it.
Look at that. Catchbox.
I have a question about the big issue of reparations.
Yeah,
Because it
yeah.
seems to be practically impossible, but then again, it's a principle which is correct. Can you say something about the position of the reparation issue and the prospect of that being ever resolved in any dignified or equal way?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question. People have tried to calculate what was the value of 250 years of slavery in modern day terms. How much money would that be? It's a lot. It's a whole lot of money of unpaid labor by the slaves. Turns out Catholic University in Washington, D.C., Catholic University or Georgetown University, built itself by selling off like 80-some slaves back in the 1800s. So even the academic institutions benefited from slavery. So their reparation is finding the descendants of those slaves and giving them free tuition and recruiting them. But of course, that's not enough at all. So at the national level, we're far away from, because of the government that we currently have, we're far away from the idea of reparations. But it's an important idea to always have there, because if we translated that into a program of jobs, housing, income support, education, the very things King was talking about, we could call that reparations. It would require a change of priorities. Instead of spending $1 trillion on nuclear weapons, spend $1 trillion on reparations. And it would include poor white people too. And King would see it that way, I think. So it's not going to happen right now, but it's not something we should ever take off the table. Here's somebody over here.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot
That's
also
cool.
for the music.
Uh-huh.
I was wondering about the land of the free and the brave. I think that there is a problem with the idea of freedom there when it comes to labor rights. It happened to me that a classmate of mine in Chicago, it was college, told me about his dad in Minnesota. He's a miner, and he would work 13 hours. And the point was that he decided to do that. When I reacted like, wow, that's not possible, it's probably illegal, or why does he do that? Well, it's his right, and he decided to do that. It's good for him because he can get more money out of that. So the idea was freedom. And this was a very educated, brilliant, morally determined person. So I started wondering what this freedom is about.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
We have a real problem in the United States about the issue of freedom versus equality. And a lot of people pick freedom as this, like what your example there, your personal right to accumulate wealth by whatever means you can, even if it's killing you. And the other side of it would be the social democratic compact, of freedom as part of a group and responsibility to everyone. And unfortunately, in the United States, this idea of freedom as I can get rich is predominant, even among working class people. So we've got a lot of work to do to reconceptualize what freedom means. But the freedom songs that I use, these are slaves. They're not talking about becoming capitalists. They just want a decent life. And that, to me, is more important freedom than the freedom to get rich. Yeah.
Thanks.
Oh.
Thank you for the talk. It was really interesting to see, because I've never thought of King as in terms of economic justice. That was really interesting. I was just wondering, what do you think contemporary politicians in the US can do to kind of relink civil rights and economic justice?
Yeah.
What steps do you think they should take?
What can politicians do today, or political activists, to link civil rights and economic justice? Are you following the career of Anastasia Ocasio-Cortez? She has this idea of the Green New Deal, which a lot of people are scoffing at, oh, forget about it. her idea is that you can link civil rights and economic justice by part of a larger program to rebuild the economy in a positive direction that responds to global warming and the planetary crisis that we're in. And I think that in the United States, you have to link civil rights and economic justice. You can't get one without the other. And to just talk about economic justice without talking about these other issues would be wrong. And on the other hand, as King said, you know, you can't get civil rights and freedom if you don't have economic justice. So I think that people are, there's a left wing in the United States like everywhere. People understand that. And we need to get the majority to understand it. And then to get it enacted, you know, through legislation, that's a big, big struggle. But it's not impossible. One thing I would like to say, you know, that sometimes this history people just get like overwhelmed. Oh my God. But remember, we once had slavery in the United States. We got rid of that. We once had Jim Crow segregation. We got rid of that. These things have changed dramatically. So I think economic justice and civil rights for women, for people of color, for immigrants, for Latinos, for Native Americans, these things can happen. We've got the money. We've got the wealth. But how is it being used? So the U.S. has plenty of wealth. It just needs to use it in a better way.
I think that's...
Thank you very much for coming at 8:30 in the morning. I thought, who's going to come at 8:30 in the morning? But it's wonderful to talk with you, and I'll be here if anybody wants to talk some more.